Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be going over a t-test design here in SPSS. So this is different than the previous ones we've looked at as correlations. Remember, with correlations, we were just looking for patterns and similarities between different variables. Here, with a t-test, we're actually going to be looking at how one variable may have an actual effect on another variable. So we're looking for cause and effect. And we use what are known as independent and dependent variables to look at these effects. And so this is also what's known as an experimental design. So we're going to go ahead and look through this type of test today. We're going to talk about an example here as we go. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you go ahead and pull up the assignment sheet as well as a blank SPSS sheet for you to follow along as we go through this. I'm going to go ahead and switch over now. Go ahead and get that stuff pulled up if you haven't done so already. All right, so this is the assignment we're going to be working through today. So in this specific situation, or the set of data that we have, what is going on is the experimenter is interested in looking at arachnophobia and studying this effect on people. But they want to know if this fear of spiders, right, if that same fear is going to be elicited through real spiders as well as just pictures of spiders. So are both of those two types of stimuli going to elicit the same type of fear to these people with arachnophobia? So what they did is they took 24 people, all of which said they had arachnophobia, and they split them into two groups. So a group of 12 and a group of 12. One of those groups was asked to actually play with real spiders, in this case a tarantula, as cruel as that may be. They were asked to play with a real tarantula, while the other group was asked to look at pictures of tarantulas. So again, one group playing with real spiders, one group just looking at pictures of spiders. And so what they did then is they measured the anxiety of these participants in a couple different ways. First, they looked at a self-report of anxiety. So they filled out a questionnaire and got a score on how anxious they were. And then they also took saliva samples from the participants to assess their level of cortisol, which is a stress hormone in the body. So we got two measures of stress. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about these first few questions before we move over into SPSS. So question one wants us to identify what the experimenter's study and null hypothesis are. So these are going to be two different hypotheses based on whether or not there is an effect or there is not an effect. So the study hypothesis would simply be that there would be a difference between the level of stress or anxiety in people that saw the real spider versus the picture of spiders. So again, study hypothesis is that there is a difference between the two groups. The null hypothesis would be then that there is no difference between the two groups, that stress is the same regardless of which type of spider, either real or picture, they were exposed to. And so what we're going to do is we'll work through this and basically try to support one of these two hypotheses, either the study or the null hypothesis. All right, question two asks us to identify what is the independent and dependent variable of this study. So we have one independent variable, and that is simply the type of spider, either real or picture. So it's one variable with two levels. So you can kind of think about it that way, but it's still just one thing that is varying or changing, which is the type of spider they're interacting with. And again, that has two levels, either a real spider or a picture of a spider. The dependent variable here, we actually have two separate dependent variables, and we can see that up here at the top. We have one dependent variable that we're looking at, that is the self-report measure of anxiety that we see here. And then we also have another dependent variable, which is the levels of the hormone cortisol that we see here. So those are our two dependent variables that we have. Again, one independent variable, type of spider, two dependent variables. And then our last pre-question here is question three, which is asking us what is the experimental design of this group. So there's three possible answers, either within subjects, between subjects, or a mixed study design. So really, how we answer this question is we need to look at the independent variable and use that to inform us on what type of design this is. So the way this works is a within subjects design every participant is experiencing all levels of the independent variable. A between subjects design means that each participant only experiences one level of the independent variable. And then a mixed design would be that we have multiple independent variables, some that are within and some that are between. So right now, since we know we only have one independent variable, we can eliminate the mixed design. We know that's not what it is. So it's either within or between subjects. And to answer that, we have to look at our independent variable and how our groups are broken up. So we have two separate groups. One group sees just real spiders. Another group sees just pictures of spiders. So each participant is only experiencing one level of our independent variable. So we know that we have a between subjects design. All right. Now that we've answered these first few questions, let's go on and look at our data. So this is the data we're going to be putting into SPSS. Let's just kind of take a look at it first and see what we have here. So we've got our participant number showing up on the left. We have our grouping variable, which you can see is either going to be a 0 or a 1. We have our anxiety score. This is on their self-report measure of anxiety. And then we also have their cortisol level from that saliva sample. If we look back at this group value as well, we can see a 0 represents those in the picture spider group, and a 1 represents those in the real spider group. So that's how we know which group each participant was assigned to. All right, so let's go ahead. We're going to switch over to SPSS, and we're going to go ahead and start setting up our data here. So if we switch over to SPSS, we can remember how this is sort of set up here. We've got our data sheet. I guess I have to zoom or scroll down here. But we've got our, let me actually just zoom out a little bit and see if that helps. No, it's not cooperating with me. But we've got our data set here. And then as we scroll down, or hopefully it's on the same screen for you, you can see we have our data view and our variable view, those two different views of our sheet that we can kind of switch back and forth between. And we're going to start on our variable view here. Again, scroll back up to the top. And we're going to go ahead and set up our variables first so that we can have those ready to go for when we enter in or copy and paste our data in. So let's go ahead and set up our variables that we have, starting with our participant number. Remember, SPSS doesn't like spaces in these variable names, so just be careful how you're labeling these. So we have our participant number, we have our group, and then we also have our self-report anxiety scale, and then also our cortisol scale, or our cortisol measure, I should say. First thing I like to do is I like to check these first three columns and just make sure that these are all set up correctly. So the type is set to numeric, so that means we're going to be entering numbers for all of our data. No individual string of numbers is going to be more than 8 digits long, which is fine. We have a limit of 8 set here. And then how many decimals we're using. So let's just quickly kind of switch back to our data set here. And we can see that we are in fact entering all numbers, so we're good there. Nothing is longer than 8 digits long for a single data point. And we're not actually using any decimals, so we can go ahead and remove those decimal places just to make our data look a little bit cleaner. So let's go ahead and we'll actually reduce the decimals down to 0. All right, for our measurement type, we're going to go ahead, we're going to not do that for participant number, but for our group anxiety and cortisol, let's just go ahead and set this so that we know kind of what we're doing here. So for our grouping variable, I'm going to set this to nominal because we have separate groups. We don't necessarily know the order to them or if there is an order to them, just that we have two different types of spider groups. And then for our anxiety and cortisol, those are both going to be scale measurements because we know that they are on some type of continuous scale. Lastly, the last thing we need to do here is we need to assign or tell SPSS what those grouping values mean. Remember, if we look at our data, a value of 0 represents those in the picture spider group, and a value of 1 represents those in the real spider group. So if we just were to enter in these values into SPSS, it's not going to know what these numbers mean unless we tell it what they mean. So we need to go ahead and code this into SPSS in that variable view. So let's go ahead and look here. And the way we do this is we look at the variable that we're assigning, which in this case is our group variable, and we go to this column called values. And so if I click on this cell, it's going to let me click on the right and edit this cell to now be able to enter in some different rules that I have. So I can click the plus to add a new rule, and I can say that a value of 0, which is one of those numbers we're going to be entering in, represents the label. Let's just double check this. A 0 represents the label of picture, right? So this is the picture spider group. So you can put a label of picture. Let's add another one. And now a value of 1 represents the real spider group. So we can go ahead and label that as real spider. Once I've entered both of these two labels in for the values that they represent, I can hit OK. And you'll notice that it kind of adds this up here to the top so you know that it's working correctly. All right, with those entered in, what I can do now is I should be able to come down to the bottom and go back to my data view. And now I can see that my variable names are all added to the top. And I can now start getting ready to enter in all of my data. So remember, the best way to try and do this is first to copy and paste. Hopefully that works. You could always enter them in manually, but it's going to be better to copy and paste so that you know that you're not making any mistakes or things like that. So remember, when we're copying, we want to make sure that we highlight just the data itself. Don't get any labels or titles or anything like that. Just the data itself. Make sure we go all the way down. We get all 24 participants. Have that all highlighted. Then we want to copy this data. And then when we go back to SPSS, remember we want to paste by just having that first cell selected with that gray outline. Remember, if I were to double click, it gives me this cursor blinking. I don't want that. I want a single click where I get a gray box on the very first cell under my participant number label. And then the best way to try and do this is to use the keyboard shortcut first, which if you're on PC is going to be Control V. If you're on Mac, I believe it's Command V. And so you want to try and hit that keyboard shortcut, and hopefully what it's going to do is paste in your values. Now, as you can see, it's not cooperating with me here. So I'm going to try and go up to Edit and select this paste option here and see if this works for me. And if I do that, notice that worked for me right there. So that's an alternative way that you can get it to paste. You can also try and right click and choose paste as well, though sometimes that may be grayed out and not show as an option. If all three of those methods aren't working for you, what I recommend you do is just wait maybe 30 seconds and then try again. Sometimes SPSS takes a minute to register that you've copied something on your computer. All right, so let's take a look at what we have entered in here. I'm actually going to zoom in here a little bit just so that we get a better view of what's going on. So we have our participant number variable, our group anxiety and cortisol should be all the same, just like we had it in our Word document. What you'll notice is that even though the values that I pasted in were 0s and 1s, because I made those labels, I'm getting the values of picture and real spider showing up here for my group. Now, if you don't see that, all you need to do is come up here to this button up here called Value Labels. And if you click this button, what's going to happen is it's going to toggle between either the numerical values that you copied in, 0s and 1s, or if you hit it again, it's going to switch between the labels that we created for those. And you can always switch back and forth between them. It's not going to change anything. It's just for you to be able to see what those group values mean. It's just a helpful tool to keep track of those. So I'm going to leave them like this because I think it's easier to see for now. All right, hopefully you have your data in and ready to go, and we can move on to the next question. So let's switch back over and take a look at what the next step we're going to do is. All right, so when we're looking at t-test and especially different experimental designs, one of the things we look for is whether or not there are significant differences between our groups. And if there's significant differences between our groups, that's normally what we indicate as a significant effect or a significant finding, because it means that whatever our independent variable was is having an effect. It's changing the values of our dependent variable, and they're different from each other. But we want to make sure that they're different enough from each other to actually be considered significant. So what we're actually going to do here first is we're going to make a graph, and we're going to look at this graph to help inform us on what we think is going on between our two groups. So what type of graph we're going to make is called an error bar graph. And this is going to show us basically just those error bars and how different our two groups are from one another. So we're going to have to do this twice for each dependent variable. So let's go ahead and talk about how to do this in SPSS. And we're going to start off with just that regular anxiety value. So if we're in SPSS, remember I said we're going to make a graph first. So we're going to start by going to the Graphs tab up here in the top section. So under graphs, now this depends on what type of SPSS you're using. If you're on one of the newer versions, you'll see all of these options right here. If you're on an older version, you'll have to go to legacy dialogues, and then that's going to pop out all of these options. But what we want to look for is what's known as an error bar graph. So I'm going to scroll down until I find error bar and then click on that. All right, we get a pop-up window that appears. We can keep this as it is by default. We want simple and then summaries for groups of cases. That's all fine and good to go. So I can just hit define here. And now I get my window that pops up, and I just need to tell it what I'm looking for. So in this case, I want my category axis, or how I'm separating things out, to be my grouping variable. So I want to look at the differences between my two groups, either the picture or the real spiders. And then the variable I'm concerned about or would like to see the difference in, let's start off by looking at anxiety. So we're going to come back and do this again for cortisol, but we'll start with anxiety first. So I'm going to put that in. We're using a 95% confidence interval. That kind of pairs with our 0.05 alpha level, which is normally what we use for our p-value to say that it's a significant difference or a significant effect. So we're going to leave that at 95% and hit OK and take a look at our output. Remember, whenever we get our first set of output, it's going to pop up a new window entirely. Notice down here, I now have two separate windows. I have my data set and then my output window. These are separate files. Make sure you keep that in mind. All right, let's look at the graph that we have. So notice that the way this graph is set up is on the bottom, we have our two groups, those in the picture spider group and those in the real spider group. And then along the way here, we have the values on anxiety. So when we look at what we're getting here, we're getting kind of this funky, like error bar box here, but what does it really mean and how do we kind of interpret what these values are telling us? So the first thing I want to point out is that this center dot, this blue dot that you see, either here in the center for the picture or here in the center for the real spider, those are the mean values, the actual mean value of each of those groups on their anxiety score. So if we were to just take those mean values, it would appear that the real spider group had higher anxiety, right? It has a mean value of about, 47 compared to 40 for the picture spider group. However, we need to pay attention to how far these bars are actually extending and whether or not they're overlapping or touching each other. So what I mean by that, let me actually go ahead and I'm just going to grab this graph here so that I can kind of mark this up a little bit. So what we want to pay attention to here is how far these bars extend out. So what I mean by that is you can see that the top of this bar is intersecting this section or the real spider section, just like the bottom of the real spider is intersecting the picture spider range. And so when we see that happening, that's normally going to mean that there's not a significant difference between these groups. Even though it looks like real spider is higher, we can't say that it's significantly higher. And the reason for this is, remember, this is a 95% confidence interval, right? 95%. What that means is that even though this was the real mean this time, these were the actual mean values, what it means is that if we were to rerun this study over and over and over again, this mean value is going to fluctuate. It's not going to be exactly 40 every single time. It'll change slightly. But what we expect to find is that 95% of the time, this mean value is going to fall somewhere inside of this range. Same thing with this one. somewhere inside of this range. And so what might end up happening, let's say we reran this again, and what we end up finding is that maybe the picture group gets a mean value up here, closer to 45, right? We rerun it again, and in that same study, maybe the real spider group that time gets a mean value of maybe, 41, 42. And if we were to just look at those values, well, now it looks like the picture spider group has a higher mean value because it's still possible within this range for that to happen. So because of that, we would say that these are not significantly different from one another, right? Because there's a chance that those means could bounce and fluctuate which one is higher than the other inside of these ranges. I hope that makes sense. But again, if they're overlapping, we would say that they're not significantly different from one another. Let's take a look at our other variable, our cortisol variable, and see if we see the same thing or maybe something different. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to go to graphs, and I'm going to go to error bar graph, and again, keep this all the same as it is by default and define this. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my anxiety variable, I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to take my cortisol variable and put that in. So I'm just rerunning the same error bar graph, but now I'm looking at my other dependent variable, my cortisol level. Remember those that stress hormone in the saliva sample. And if I hit OK and get a new graph, what I see in this graph is maybe something a little bit different. So again, I'm going to just go ahead and grab this so I can mark this up. And what we see here now is that these error bars are much tighter together. There's no overlap happening. I can draw this out and it doesn't intersect this range for the real spider group. I can draw this one out and it's again not going to intersect the picture spider range. So because none of these are intersecting, we would expect that no matter where that mean value falls within inside these ranges, even if the real spider group was as low as it could be and the picture spider group was as high as it could be, we are always still going to see an increase for the real spider group. So because of that, we'd say that there is a significant difference here because pretty much, 95% of the time, we're going to see a higher real spider group compared to the picture spider group. So again, just to kind of summarize that, what we're looking for is whether or not these are overlapping. And since these are not overlapping, we'd say that we do see a significant difference. All right. So with that said, let's take a look now at our document one more time and see where we're at. So the next question basically asks us to describe what we just went over. So looking at the anxiety variable and the cortisol variable, how do those graphs tell us, or what do those graphs tell us about what we expect to find when we run our statistical tests? Do we expect to see a significant difference in anxiety? Do we expect to see a significant difference in cortisol based on those graphs and whether or not those error bars are overlapping? So I'll let you guys answer these questions on your own, but go ahead and answer that. You can pause if you need to, and then move on when you're ready for the next question. All right, so the next question here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually run our t-test next. So we're going to go into SPSS and we're going to walk through the way that we would go ahead and actually run this statistical test. So you can follow along with the words here on your assignment, or you can kind of watch as I do this here in SPSS. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch back to my data sheet. Again, should be down here on the bottom for you. And then I'm going to scroll up to the top just to make sure that I'm working in the right window. Sometimes if you have multiple data sheets open for SPSS, you want to make sure you're running your analysis on the right sheet. So I'm going to go to that sheet. And then because I'm ready to run some type of analysis, I'm going to go to Analyze up here at the top. And now I need to figure out where the t-test might be showing up. So before, when we were working pretty much in correlations, it was really easy because correlate was sort of this first, it was on this first screen, easy to find. But now you don't notice, or you might notice that there is no option for t-test that appears right on the first page. So what we're actually looking for, if you're in one of the newer versions of SPSS, is something called compare means and proportions. Older version, it's just going to say compare means. But that's exactly what we're doing. We're looking at the mean values between our two different groups, our picture group and our real spider group. So if I go to compare means and proportions, you'll see now I'm seeing a bunch of t-tests that are starting to show up. So that might indicate I'm probably in the right place. But now I need to determine which t-test am I actually going to use. So the two that you'll use most often are either going to be the independent samples t-test or the paired samples t-test. And these equate to either a within or a between subjects design. So for us, remember we have a between subjects design. We have separate groups of participants experiencing different levels of our independent variable. So what we want to do is the independent samples t-test. This is going to give us our between subjects design for a t-test. So if I select this, it's going to bring up my next window. And this is where I need to tell it a couple different things. I need to tell it what variables I'm interested in looking at. These are my dependent variables. And then what my grouping variable is, or essentially what my independent variable is. So let's start off with our dependent variables here. We know that those two are, and you can look back at your answer sheet from question, I believe it was question 2, maybe. Our two dependent variables are going to be anxiety, our self-report measure, and cortisol, our stress response from the saliva sample. And then next, what we have to do is tell it what our grouping variable is. And of course, this is going to be our group right here. So I'm going to take that and put that in to my grouping variable. Notice, though, a couple things. Number one, we see these question marks showing up. And also, we can't hit OK. We can't run this test yet. So we're missing something. We have to tell it something else in order to run this test. And that is, we need to come in here and define our group so it knows what we're actually wanting to include in this t-test. So if I go to define groups, what this shows up is what values I want used for each of my two groups. So the reason this appears is because for t-test, we can only ever look at two levels or two groups at a time. If we wanted to compare 3 or more groups, we'd have to use a different type of test called an ANOVA. So since we're doing a t-test here, we just have 2 groups, but SPSS doesn't necessarily know that. We could have more data here if we wanted, but we need to tell it what our 2 values are that we're using. So notice that we actually have, let me actually just close out of this. Notice that we have either 0s or 1s for our values here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define my groups, and I'm going to say for group 1, I want everybody that has a 0 in this column to be placed into group 1. And for the second group, I want everybody that has a 1 to be placed into that second group. So now I've defined the values for my 2 groups, and I can hit continue. Now you'll see it puts those values in, and I can hit OK and run this if I'd like. I always like to check my options window here to make sure things are set up correctly with my 95% confidence interval, which is the way we want things set up. Everything else should be good by default, so we can hit continue and go ahead and run this analysis. With all that set up correctly, I can hit OK. It's going to run through this t-test and appear in my output window. Now, we've got a few different things to look at and talk about, but let's go ahead and just kind of break down what these 3 tables are so that we understand kind of what we should be looking at to answer the next few questions. So this first table is just our descriptive statistics. So it tells us our mean, our standard deviation for each of our groups. Notice we have our 2 measures, our anxiety dependent variable and our cortisol dependent variable, separated out by our 2 groups. And that's really what we're doing. We almost have 2 separate t-tests that we're looking at here. So in one of them, we're looking at the difference between, in one of them, we are looking at the difference between the mean value for the picture spider group and the mean value for the real spider group on their self-report measure of anxiety. And on the other t-test, we're looking at the difference between the mean value of the picture group and the mean value of the real spider group on their measure of cortisol. So that's what our two tests are. They're comparing these two values and these two values when we're running that analysis. So first table is just those descriptives. The second table is actually the t-test itself. There's a lot of information on this. We're going to break this down here in a minute, but just know this is the actual t-test that'll be looking to tell us whether or not those two means are significantly different from each other. Again, for anxiety on the top half and cortisol on the bottom half. And then the last table is our effect sizes. This tells us just some extra information like Cohen's d about how strong of an effect each of these two measures had. All right, let's take a look at the questions and see what it is it wants us to put in. So question 5 is really just having us report and write down what those descriptive statistics are for each of our groups. So notice the first question here on question 5 is looking at the anxiety, and it wants you to report the mean and standard deviation for the picture group, and then the real spider group, same thing. And then down here, same thing for cortisol. So we're basically looking at this graph, this group statistics table, and we're looking for the mean and standard deviation of each of our groups here. So go ahead and copy those values. Make sure you put them in the correct place for each of those so that we know that you understand kind of how that table works and is broken up. All right, you may need to pause to get that, but let's go on to the next question here once you have completed the previous one. So next, we're actually going to look at that t-statistic table and kind of break that down and look for some important information that's going to tell us basically what our t-test informed us on. Again, remember we have our first one for anxiety and our second one for cortisol. So let's look at this table and kind of try and break this down and understand what's really going on here. So let me go ahead and pull this over just so that I can kind of mark this up and explain what's going on. All right, can I get rid of that? There we go. Okay, so what we have here is our t-test table. And there's a lot of information kind of showing up here and a lot that we can kind of talk about. Let me go ahead actually and, no, this is fine. This is fine. The first set of information is going to be everything for anxiety, and the second set is everything for cortisol. Notice what we might want to look for is our significance value to know whether or not we had a significance less than 0.05. Now, when we're doing that, we need to be careful because we need to make sure that we are looking at the t-test section of this table, not the Levene's test. So notice a few different things. This section here on the right is everything for our t-test. This is the actual t-test that we're interested in and want to focus on. This left section here is what's known as our Levene's test. This is something else that's going to tell us sort of about the variance within each of these groups. And this is useful for a couple different things. Number one, and the main reason why it's here, is it's useful for telling us whether or not we need to make any type of statistical adjustments in our data. And you'll notice that each of our variables, anxiety, there are 2 rows of data for, right? Each one has 2 rows. And so how we know which row to look at is based on our Levene's test. Notice there's nothing here for that. So if our Levene's test is significant, that means we need to do some type of statistical adjustments, which have actually been done for us and appear in this second row. However, if this is not significant, which both of these are not, then we can ignore the second row and simply focus on this top row for each of our variables. So the top row for anxiety and the top row for cortisol. So if we're kind of breaking this down, we see not significant, not significant. So we can now ignore this whole section and we can ignore the second row for each of our variables. So all we have left to focus on is this top set of information. Oops, just these top rows. All right, with that out of the way, we know why we're looking at just the top row. Now we can break down and find what's relevant to answer the question of if we had differences in anxiety and cortisol between our two groups. All right, so the main thing we're going to be looking at is our t-test, the value of our t-test, our degrees of freedom, and our significance value. And so in this case, we didn't necessarily specify whether or not this was going to be larger or not, though I think you could have made an argument of which direction you are anticipating this change to be. So we should really be using the two-sided p-value here since we didn't specify a direction. So we're going to look at this value here of 0.107 and this value here of less than 0.001. So what this tells us, let's go ahead first and take these values, our t, our degrees of freedom, and our p-value, t, degrees of freedom, and p-value, and report those for question 6. Our t statistic, our degrees of freedom, and our p-value for anxiety, and then our t, degrees of freedom, and p-value for cortisol. And these are really the most important pieces of information or the most important values on that table for us to answer our hypothesis or our question, our research question. And so if we report those values, question 7 now asks us to interpret those and identify whether or not the group means were different for the picture and the real spider group in our two different measures. So we're looking for that p-value to be less than 0.05. So for anxiety, if we look again at that value, that was, 0.107, we would have to say no, right? That's not significantly different. It's not a big enough difference between those two means for us to classify it as significant. So we'd say no, there's no significant difference for anxiety, right? No significant difference here for anxiety. However, for cortisol, we can see that that p-value is less than 0.05. It's actually less than 0.001. So it is definitely significant, and we would certainly say that it is. And if you recall back to our graphs, our error bar graphs, this aligns with what we thought we would find. All right. So with that question, the last one we have here to do is to do a practice write-up of our results. So the way you go ahead and write these up, it's a pretty formulaic way that we use so that we stay in APA format and we get all of the relevant information that we need to report for our results. And basically everything we've filled in so far on question 5 and question 6 is what we're going to use to write up our results for question 8. So we're going to start off, you can follow this example, but we're going to do this twice. We're going to do it once for our anxiety variable and once for our cortisol variable. So I'm going to go ahead and show you an example here, and we'll do the anxiety one together, and then I'll let you guys do the cortisol one on your own. So following sort of the example here, we could say something like, right, an independent samples t-test indicated that there was a significant difference in, or that, I take this back, that there was not a significant difference in anxiety levels. We could even say self-report anxiety levels. Oops. Between individuals who interacted or saw, either way, with pictures of spiders. And we're going to come back and add in some information in there. From those who saw or interacted with real spiders. And we're going to come in and add some information back in there. So now we've got all the words that we need said, and now what we need to do is add in all the values, the numerical information that's relevant when we mentioned it. So we're going to start off, notice in here we have our descriptive statistics after each group that we mentioned. So for the picture spider group, remember we're talking about anxiety here, we need to report the mean and standard deviation of those or of that group. So we're going to look for our mean value and we're going to look for our standard deviation value. So the mean value of our picture spider group of our anxiety was, so if we go back to our table here, look for the mean value of our picture spider group on anxiety, that mean value was 40 even, so 40.00. And our standard deviation for that value was 9.29. Same thing here for our real spider group. The mean value was, in this case, for our anxiety real spider group was 47 even. And the standard deviation here was equal to 11.03 if we round up to 2 decimals. Now we've got our descriptive statistics entered in, but we also need at the very end of the sentence to include our t-statistic. And so we're going to put a comma at the end of what we said before the end of that sentence, and we're going to add in our t-statistic and our p-value. So I'm going to say t was, I'm going to come back and add something in here, but I'm going to say that t was equal to a value of, and if I look back, I find that t was equal to a value of, for anxiety, negative 1.68. So negative 1.68. And in this case, P was equal to, what was it? 0.107. So remember, we're looking at the two-tailed p-test here. So we're looking at the 0.107 as our value. Now remember I said I was going to go back in and add something here. Notice right after our t, we need some information added. And what that actually is your degrees of freedom. So inside those parentheses, right after the t is going to be your degrees of freedom. Let's go ahead and look and double check. We know degrees of freedom for anxiety here is 22. So I'm going to go ahead and add in 22 as my degrees of freedom here. And I am almost done. One thing left to do, and that is to make sure that I've italicized any statistical abbreviation that I have. So the letter P, the letter T, and also my mean and standard deviation. All of those, just the letter, not the numbers, just the letter needs to be italicized for this to be in APA format. Once you've done that, then this is an example of a correctly formatted and written up APA result explaining what it was that you found for your t-test. So remember, this was just for our self-report anxiety measure. You need to go ahead and do this one more time for your cortisol dependent variable. So you have another sentence or paragraph here explaining what you found for that. Once you've done that, remember to copy your output images and paste them into your assignment so that you can get credit for your SPSS as well. What I'm looking for your output here, make sure I'm looking for your 2 graphs, right? Your 2 graphs here for the anxiety, your cortisol, and then also, of course, your 3 tables, your group statistic, your independent samples t-test, and then if you got it, your effect size. If that didn't come up for you, don't worry about that, but make sure you have at least the 2 graphs and the 2 tables copied into your assignment sheet here. All right, and with that, that should wrap this assignment up. So you can go ahead and finish that, get that submitted, of course. Let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise, I hope this goes well for you. All right, thank you.